So today I want to talk about Mark Winterbottom and cover his whole career and talk about one of the things that we talk about when we talk about older drivers. And there are plenty of people out there saying, oh, Frosty's past it, he's no good, make way for a young guy. And I thought, alright, let's give this the attention that a question like this deserves. At one point, Frosty was really, really good. This was back in his first several years at FPR. He was racking up pole positions, he was demolishing his teammate, was very impressive. And then over the years since then, his teammates became more and more competitive, and he gradually was not able to match those teammates or frequently beat those teammates, and he started to fall backwards. So I'm going to go into more detail about that. First of all, obviously came through as the 2003 Konica Series champion. He was a Stone Brothers protege. He drove for SBR in 2003, won the Konica Series, and also drove one of their cars at Sandown and Bathurst with Mark Noske, and did a decent job. In 2004, he got promoted to the main game, but they didn't have any seats at Stone Brothers, and so he got loaned to Larkham Motorsport as teammates to Jason Bargwanna. Coming up against a guy like Jason Bargwanna, who'd been in the category for 6 years at that point, you're coming up against somebody who's at their peak. So you can't expect someone like Frosty to come through and immediately start setting the world on fire. It's pretty rare to find a driver who just jumps in and does an amazing job straight away, especially against somebody who has won races and scored pole positions and done very well in their career. Frosty started off only on a rare occasion. I think it was 2 out of 13. 2 out of 13 times that Frosty out-qualified Bargs. And you could argue maybe there was some sort of issue in qualifying. But also, 2 out of 13 is better than 0 out of 13. Frosty got a top 10, Bargs got 8, Bargs also got a podium, and they had pretty competitive cars that year. So, pretty ordinary rookie season. But he did pretty decently. He came 18th in the championship. 2005, the team fell off a cliff. They did not have very reliable cars. They didn't have very competitive cars. But then things started to change. Frosty suddenly was increasingly better at qualifying, and he was pretty even split. 6 out of 13 times that Frosty out-qualified Bargs. And you could say there's things to do with the reliability and stuff like that. But it's 46% of the time, so just under half the time Frosty was out-qualifying Bargs. Didn't get any top 10s that year, but it was harder to come by. Bargs had either some lucky races or some very good races and got a couple of top 10s. Frosty came something like 29th in the championship. It was awful, and there were a lot of DNFs involved in that season as well. But Frosty got picked to go to FPR for 2006. And while we saw Frosty match Bargs in 2005, in 2006, Jason Bright pretty much smashed Frosty all year. In terms of qualifying, it was 2 out of 11 times that Frosty out-qualified Brighty. So pretty much the same sort of deal as when Frosty had his rookie year against Bargs. Except it was a little bit different in 2006 because Frosty was very consistent, and he was able to get podiums when they came his way, and he scored more top 10s than Brighty. But maybe Brighty had that flat tyre at Darwin that could have cost him a win. Frosty did a very good job, and they won the Sandown 500, and Frosty got his first solo win at Phillip Island. I think it was the last race of the year. Then we go to 2007, Brighty moves on, Stephen Richards comes in, another high caliber driver who's won races, scored pole positions, done very well. Suddenly the tables have turned. Frosty is settled in the team, he knows what he's doing. I don't know if it was something to do with the way that team operated at the time, if they had like a number one driver and organised things around that driver, but suddenly Frosty was smashing Richo. 69% of the time, Frosty out-qualified Richo, which for a guy like Richo, you would expect him to be a lot closer to Frosty, but that's just not the case. So Frosty out-qualified him 69% of the time, got more top 10s than Richo. Richo had a couple bad races, but I think you make your own luck if you qualify down the back. You can't expect things to always work out. The mid-pack's pretty fierce. Probably the biggest deal for Frosty was he got the pole award, which was not, I don't know if that was a thing in 2007, but Frosty qualified on pole position more times than anyone else. And back in 2007, they only had one qualifying session for the whole weekend. And so he beat guys like Garth Tander and Todd Kelly to get that. He was a lot better at getting pole positions than Jamie Whincup as well. That was Frosty's big year. He didn't come third in the championship like he did in 2006, but he came fifth, and he was definitely impressive. He really shone as the lead driver. He also got pole position at Bathurst, and obviously they had a big lose through the chase, and after that it was a rough day for them. 2008 was Frosty's first shot at the championship. So Frosty smashed Richo again, even more. 83% of the time, Frosty out-qualifying Richo. 30 top 10s versus 23, and not as many pole positions as he might have liked. Garth Tander and Jamie Whincup really came to the fore and did very good jobs against Frosty. In 2008, Frosty came second in the championship to Jamie Whincup, so that was definitely a changing of the guard that we started to see back then. 2009, the team struggled a bit with the FG Falcon. Even more, Frosty out-qualified Richo, 91%. And also, 2009 was the first year that they introduced separate qualifying sessions for each race. Richo had more opportunities to beat Frosty, but Frosty had more opportunities to beat Richo, and it definitely seemed like Frosty was just fast. Richo really fell off a cliff from 2009 onwards, and I might do a separate video about Richo because, we talk about, is it fair to compare drivers and say this guy's better than that guy? Well, it's sport. We compare them. It's a championship. That's how it works. Frosty got 17 top 10s to Richo's 8. More pole positions in 2009, so it's not like the car wasn't very good all the time, but Frosty got 6 pole positions to Whincup's 7, so he was pretty close to getting the pole award again. So Frosty was definitely on song that year. 5th in the championship. It wasn't a great time for them that year, but they came back in 2010. But this time in 2010, they had Paul Dumbrell, who pulled his finger out and made up for Richo's downturn in performance. Frosty's out-qualifying his teammates. Obviously, he got another driver to compete against to out-qualify both teammates. 80% of the time he did it, so he's still good. He was the only one to have been racking up that many pole positions. He got 5 pole positions, equal second with Garth Tander. Jamie Whincup ran away with it in 2010 with 9. I guess special mention James Courtney wasn't even close. And Frosty got 19 top 10s to Richo's 7 and Paul Dumbrell's 16. 3rd in the championship, and obviously pole position at Bathurst. Things just didn't quite go their way at Bathurst for many years. 2011 comes along, so Paul Dumbrell sort of falls off a cliff. I think he had some distractions during the year, so he wasn't quite as focused. He still had his qualifying pace, so he was good at pulling a lap out of his ass. But now Frosty had an up-and-comer as his teammate in Will Davison. And Davo really showed it to Frosty in 2011. And it wouldn't get easier from this point onwards. 50% of the time, Frosty out-qualified his teammates. And obviously most of the time it was going to be Davo, but there were also times where Paul Dumbrell was the top qualifier. Frosty and Davo were equal in number of poles, with 4. That's equal 3rd in the pole award chase. Frosty came, I think it was 3rd in the championship. He did come 3rd in a row for a few years. Davo had a bit of trouble with consistency. Came 7th. It was 19 top 10s for Frosty versus 15 for Davo and 5 for Paul Dumbrell. 2012, even tougher. Davo had just something about the car that year that he found worked perfectly with his style, and also they got a new driver in David Reynolds who was very fast. So suddenly you've got 3 really competitive drivers. Davo was really showing it to Frosty and Dave Reynolds. Davo got the pole award with 8. Frosty only got 4 pole positions, down in the fourth highest number of pole positions. But Frosty had consistency. Frosty's consistency has been a big part of his success in the sport. Is just not getting in too many crashes, not taking big risks. So he racked up a lot of pole positions, racked up a lot of top 10s. He still beat Davo in the championship, 3rd versus 4th. Reynolds, a bit more aggressive driving style, gotten a few more incidents and things like that. And not always on par with Davo and Frosty. And Frosty got 27 top 10s to Davo's 21, and Dave Reynolds 16. And the percentage for qualifying, Frosty's 33%. So even split amongst the teammates. 2013 comes along. This is an interesting one because it looks like Frosty's back on top as the lead driver at FPR. He's got the same teammates as he had in 2012, plus Alex Davison. But it's also car of the future, so maybe Davo was unlucky, maybe Frosty just had it, and it definitely looked like Frosty just had it. Frosty was equal second with the number of poles, with 4, equal with Shane Gisbergen and Jason Bright. But Jamie Whincup was well up the road with 13 pole positions. While Frosty was better in qualifying, 58% of the time he out-qualified all 3 of his teammates. The number of top 10s he got, not quite as much. We saw a lot of hard battling in 2013 between Whincup and Frosty, and I think sometimes Frosty lost out. He got 26 top 10s versus Davo's 31, Davey Reynolds 18, and Alex Davison's 12. I guess due to his consistency, but also it was pretty tight in the last round of the season at Sydney Olympic Park to score enough points for Davo to stay in front of Frosty in the championship. Davo finished 3rd, Frosty finished 4th. It was pretty close there. We've seen a bit of a decline, but obviously Frosty had a great year. He won Bathurst and had a great battle against Jamie Whincup. So we definitely were seeing some peak performances from Frosty. And David Reynolds was obviously, he had a few great moments as well. It took a little while before we saw peak Reynolds, I guess. Yeah, you could argue that Frosty was still really good, but maybe not as great as we might have thought he was back when he was up against Stephen Richards. But, sometimes you have to go up against the best to see where you're at. And Will Davison was definitely one of the best. And David Reynolds was obviously able to show it to Frosty on his day as well. But maybe not with the consistency that Davo could do it. 2014 comes along. FPR have offloaded Davo in favour of Chaz Mostert, young gun. They've kept David Reynolds and they've signed Jack Perkins instead of Alex Davison, but that wasn't obviously their call. That was Charlie Schwerkold's call, the owner of the entry. 2014, they did not have a fast car. Frosty got no pole positions. I don't think Mostert did, or Dave Reynolds. And this is just going off memory, so it could be. They just had consistency in 2014, where Frosty had a couple of wins, but it was his consistency that held him high standing in the championship, and he had the lead at Pukekohe, which brought Mostert's future with the team into question. Frosty out-qualified all 3 of his teammates 57% of the time as well. Reynolds struggled a bit more than Mostert, and Mostert started to out-qualify Frosty a bit more towards the end of the season, so it's not like Frosty was smashing everyone all year. But he had his consistency, his racing was still really good. 27 top 10s versus 19 for Mostert, 17 for Reynolds, and 1 for Jack Perkins. 2015 comes along, and this is kind of a really noticeable year for Frosty's qualifying performances. We used to see Frosty being an absolute gun and out-qualifying all of his teammates, but 2015 it becomes obvious that Frosty is not the fastest guy at the team anymore. So they have the FGX Falcon. Mostert immediately out-qualifies Frosty at Adelaide. Frosty out-qualifies his teammates 30% of the time. That's 11 times out of 36 races, which is just not good enough. But he made up for it in the races where his consistency was incredible. He was just racking up top 10s, grabbing podiums, grabbing wins. When he qualified up the front, he was grabbing wins. But Mostert relatively wasn't able to manage that. Mostert ran away with the pole position award, got 10 poles versus Frosty's 3. Reynolds got 3 as well. So in 2015, we're seeing peak Reynolds. Frosty was racing as well as he ever was, but he was not as good as Mostert in qualifying. And a few years before, Frosty was on par with Will Davison. Now he's up against a teammate who's a lot better in his second year, perhaps similar to the way Davo was a lot better in his second year. But Frosty won the championship through consistency. He got a few pole positions after Bathurst. He got, I think, one at Phillip Island, one at Sydney Olympic Park. So he still had it when he needed it, but he wasn't able to do it as often earlier in the year when you could argue that they had a dominant car. And maybe that's just because Mostert was so good, so they might have got a lot of front row lockouts when Mostert still out-qualified Frosty. So Frosty got 30 top 10s versus Mostert's 22, because Mostert obviously had his crash at Bathurst that wrote him off for the rest of the season. David Reynolds got 30 top 10s as well as Frosty, and Andre Heimgartner got 3 top 10s. Chris Pither, his replacement mid-season, didn't get any. And the Mostert, the 22 for Mostert, that's not just Chaz Mostert, but I think Cam Waters also got a top 10 at Pukekohe, and Steve Owen didn't get any top 10s when he ran at Sydney Olympic Park. So that's just number 5 versus number 6 and number 55, not just the specific drivers. Yeah, that was probably a more telling season. 2016 comes along. Frosty's back as the lead driver in some respects. Not back to where he was, out-qualifying his teammates most of the time, 41%. And you could argue that if you've got some great teammates that are really good, then maybe you shouldn't be out-qualifying them all the time. Maybe it should be pretty even split. 41% of the time that Frosty's out-qualifying Mostert and Cam Waters, who replaced David Reynolds, and Chris Pither continuing in the team. They seem to have relatively competitive cars, but nowhere near the level that they had in 2015. But Frosty had consistency. He scored a huge number of top 10s at the first half of the season. 20 versus 5 for Waters, 18 for Mostert, and 3 for Chris Pither, because they put Chaz Mostert in the 55, and it confused me when I wrote this. So the pole award, Chaz Mostert was still out qualifying Frosty fairly often, got a lot more pole positions, or got a couple more. Mostert was in the running for the pole award in 2016, but towards the back end of the season, sort of fell off, and Winkup and SVG beat him to it. So Mostert got 5 to Frosty's 3. Cam Waters also got a couple of pole positions, and Chris Pither got a pole position as well. So it's starting to get pretty interesting for Frosty as the defending champion as well. We are starting to see Frosty not as quite as good as his teammate, and we've seen that a few times, but it's starting to really show. 2017 comes along. This is the year that Frosty no longer finishes ahead of his teammates in the championship, where his consistency doesn't make up for a lack of speed. He out-qualifies his teammates 23% of the time, and he now has a new teammate, so it's Frosty, Mostert, Waters, and Jason Bright coming back for his final season, as it turned out. Frosty out-qualified his teammates 23% of the time, and they had issues with brakes and stuff like that in the first bit of the season, but you can make up for that once you fix that, if that was the only issue. It was 6 out of 26 times that Frosty out-qualified Mostert and Waters, and I don't think Bright ever qualified Frosty. 16 top 10s versus 21 for Mostert, 14 for Waters, and 7 for Bright. No poles for Frosty. I think Mostert might have got a couple, Waters got a couple, Bright didn't get any. But we are definitely seeing Frosty fade away. 2018 comes along, and in 2017 Frosty was off contract. In negotiations they decided, alright, well, Frosty's going to stay another year, and then he'll have a think about what he wants to do. So it was a 1-year extension for Frosty in 2018. I didn't really talk about contracts before, but Frosty used to be on 3 or 4 year deals, long deals, because he was being so successful. 2018, Frosty out-qualifies his teammates 30% of the time, so it's pretty even split. But they also had a big trouble because there was a parity issue where the FGX Falcon was not as good as the ZB Commodore, and they had to make a few little changes, like some lightweight panels instead of what they were using before. And there was also just the way the ZB Commodore was designed. It was a very high downforce car, and it demolished everybody in those sorts of races. It was pretty much Mostert and Frosty who had the consistency in 2018, were able to do the job. Mostert with 22 top 10s, he just had a way with his engineer and the way that they organised themselves that made Mostert the lead guy all year. And he finished in the top 10 of the championship and nobody else in the team did. Frosty also had a new teammate in Richie Stanaway, who on occasion out-qualified Frosty as well. Frosty got 10 top 10s versus Mostert's 22, 8 top 10s for Waters, so not quite as bad as a year as it might have looked, and 1 for Richie Stanaway. No poles for Frosty, but I also think that nobody got any poles in that team anyway. And Frosty decided to move on to a different team. We've seen Frosty absolutely demolish Stephen Richards, and then he's had very good teammates that he was able to match. He's had some very good drivers as young guns coming through in Chaz Mostert and Cam Waters, starting to beat him more. Frosty's ticked off the big boxes. He won Bathurst, he's won the championship. And he said in the years since that having the number 1 on the car and being a champion of the sport, the thing he's most proud of in his career. For many years, Frosty wasn't able to do it, and we wanted to see him do it. We wanted to see him take it to Jamie Whincup. We wanted to see him beat everybody and be the champion. But I guess in 2015, maybe we didn't see it the way we wanted to see it. In 2019... Frosty moves to Team 18, so he's no longer in a front-running team. He is now in a mid-pack team, driving in a 888 built Commodore, in a big controversial switch from Ford to Holden, if anyone even cared about that at that point. It's not 2006 anymore. I don't know why it's such a big deal. Frosty got a pole for Charlie Schwerkolt at Tassie and got 12 top 10s, 13th in the championship, but he definitely... There were times in the year where you thought, let's go Frosty, we can get some top 10s, maybe we can snag a podium, but maybe that was too much to ask. And again, it's a one-car team in 2019, so it's not like we know how well he might do against his teammates. But he gets one for 2020. He gets Scott Pye as his teammate. And they were teammates for 4 years. In the first couple, Frosty was out qualifying Scott Pye most of the time, 77% in 2020, 60% in 21, 47% in 22. He started to drop away in 22. But in terms of top 10s, Frosty got more top 10s than Scott Pye every year. But Scott Pye also had some mechanical issues, and sometimes Frosty had them as well. The team just wasn't quite able to manage that as well as they might have liked. But Frosty finished in the top 10 of the championship in all 3 of those years. He was 10th in 2020, 10th in 21, and 9th in 2022. In 2023, we have the Gen 3 regulations coming along. Scott Pye is out qualifying Frosty just a little bit more often, but Frosty's getting more top 10s than Scott Pye. Frosty also got the last win of his career, 7 years after his last win with Pro Drive at the time in 2016. Then they weren't able to make the cars work quite as well in the back end of the season. Consistency was a big problem for them with their performances. And then in 2024, Scott Pye is replaced with David Reynolds. Didn't have the car to do the job as well as they might have liked. Frosty got a couple podiums, and that came from qualifying well, but he did not get that many top 10s, whereas Reynolds got more top 10s. But Frosty was still having no DNFs and was consistent enough to be scoring enough points to stay ahead of Reynolds for most of the year. And then we get to Tassie. They're even split in qualifying, even split in out-racing one another in the year. And from Tassie onwards, we see David Reynolds out-qualify Frosty more often, and he scores a bunch more top 10s than Frosty. So then it looks like, oh, that's the end of it for Frosty. Frosty was in negotiations to extend his contract, and Charlie Schwerkolt was not willing to give him that extension that Frosty might have liked. Charlie signed Anton De Pasquale on a multi-year deal, and I guess Frosty wasn't offered a multi-year deal. He might have only been offered a 1-year deal for 25 and a co-drive for 26. While Frosty was still driving well against Reynolds, you could say maybe there was something going on there that meant that Frosty wasn't able to get the results that he might have liked at the end of the season, and that could have been something to do with negotiations falling through. Maybe he wasn't as motivated. Maybe the distraction of all of that taking some wind out of his sail. You know, you could look at the overall stats and say, oh, Reynolds beat Frosty, but it was trending that way too, that from 2020 onwards, Frosty was out-qualifying his teammates less and less, but he was still pretty matched with his teammates. Might have had some opportunities, but he decided not to pursue those. He needed to think about whether he wanted to retire or not, and he decided that, yes, that was going to be the end of his career for the time being. And I think that's probably it for Frosty. He's signed a deal to join Tickford for 2025 to be the teammate, to be co-driving with Cam Waters, and I think that everybody's really happy about that. And we really want to see Frosty jump in the car and do a great job alongside Cam, because Frosty's still a great driver. He might not be demolishing his teammates or even matching his teammates quite as often, but he's definitely done a respectable job. There have been times where he's out-qualified his teammates frequently enough to go, Frosty will be really good on his day. So it's not like he was ever bad. He wasn't ever on the receiving end of being absolutely demolished by his teammate.